Yeah, I can see it. Thanks a lot, Michael. That's nice. It's good to be here with y'all. I'm talking about the history of business and entrepreneurship and industry and that sort of thing. It's a subject that I've revisited many times over the years. Knoxville is different from a lot of cities in that it's changed its guise, it's changed its persona several times over the years. It was founded strictly for just one reason, and that was to be the administrative capital of a federal territory, the Southwestern Territory, 1791. That was when the city was called Knoxville, named for William Blount's superior Henry Knox in Washington, because during the Washington administration, this was a federally controlled territory. And where the territory's boundaries were kind of up in the air. I gave a talk in New Orleans last week, and it just occurred to me then that New Orleans was capital of the Spanish colony of Louisiana at the time. Knoxville was capital of the Southwestern Territory. So Knoxville and New Orleans were capitals of territories without fixed boundaries between the places, and there was some dispute between the two. And there were anyway, there was a lot of interesting goings on, secret agents and so forth, going back and forth. But it was a very tiny little town, but was a very powerful little place because it was where all the decisions were made for this huge territory that included Tennessee and theoretically parts of the deeper South. This was Knoxville's only role for a long time. It was the only reason it was founded. The state of Tennessee was founded here, and they put the state capital here for a while. And for more than 20 years, this was the state capital. Because it was the state capital, it spawned certain kinds of industries. What does a capital need? A capital makes laws, so a capital has a big demand for books, for county seats across the state, for lawyers across the state. All the law books from the laws made in Tennessee were written and printed here in Knoxville. And naturally, there was a big call for paper mills. That was one of Knoxville's very first industries, was paper mills. And that's how we get Paper Mill Road in the Bearden area. There was a paper mill out there that went way back. But these paper mills found other uses in the presses around them. They actually published other sorts of books too. By the 1820s and 30s, they were publishing some books of poetry and some novels and things like this out of Knoxville. They're rather rare books, but if you ever find a book published in Knoxville in the 1820s and 30s, give me a call. I can either buy from you or set you up with someone who wants to. More likely the latter. But they're interesting and rare pieces of work. But also liquor in a place like Knoxville, where you had lots of the legislators from across the state who had long sessions. There was a big demand for liquor. I don't know if that was the main thing, but that was the biggest industry at one time in Knoxville. There were, believe it or not, 61 legal distilleries in Knoxville in the 1820s. I think they were probably calling them distilleries is probably glorifying stills. I think, but they were made for local consumption and also for downriver consumption. There was a whole generation of young men who left Knoxville forever because they had a big flatboat full of liquor and they knew they could sell it for a lot of money in New Orleans. And they would take the river all the way down to New Orleans, more than 1,000 miles. It took about a month to do it. But they would take these rafts down to New Orleans, sell the liquor. They would even sell the rafts for wood, because wood was in demand down there at the time. These rafts that were put together of trees from this area. But that was they would make money off that as well. And many of them didn't come back because the river was a one-way street back then. It was before steam power, before steamboats, and for Knoxville it was before trains too. This was Knoxville's main problem in those days. We lost capital status in 1819. That's when it went to first Murfreesboro and then Nashville. For practical reasons, those are closer to the middle of the state, and it just made more sense to, as more people moved across Tennessee, to have the capital in the middle part of the state. So here Knoxville was founded as a capital, and it wasn't a capital anymore. What does it do? Well, it didn't really do anything for a long time. It was, and the second bigger insult was that this was the era of steam power suddenly. That was the exciting new thing in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s. steam power that brought steamboats to Nashville and places like that. Steam power that brought railroads to this new place that nobody ever heard of called Atlanta to the south of here. But we didn't have either steamboats or railroads for mostly geographical reasons. It was steamboats had a hard time getting past Muscle Shoals and various other problems coming up the river that hadn't been quite as much a problem for flatboats going downriver. And there was even a cash prize offered to the first steamboat to reach Knoxville, and it wasn't until 1828 that the very first one did, and even then it was not. Steam transportation started, but was never quite as effective as it was in Nashville and other places, just because of those barriers that made it hard to get past. You had to have a special small steamboat to get up here with a stern-wheeler steamboat to get up to Knoxville. But also, more to the point, railroads had a hard time getting here because there were valleys and mountains and rivers all around Knoxville that were all expensive barriers to get to the city. It's somewhat ironic that in the 1790s, Knoxville was not considered very remote because everybody got around by horseback, and Knoxville was not that hard to get to by horseback. There was a road straight to Washington, but it was very hard to get railroads here, and Knoxville became more and more remote in the 19th century. So we knew we had a lot of stuff here that we could sell, but we just couldn't get it out. So there was really very little industry going on in town. And the city just really stagnated, and it could have easily slipped to become just an interesting historic place like Jonesboro or somewhere that's just remembered for this moment of historic glory that lasted for about 30 years of Knoxville's first days as a capital. But a few things happened, positive things happened in the 1840s. We got the Tennessee, was designated the home of the Tennessee School for the Deaf in 1844. This was a very big deal in ways that might be hard to recall. At the time, Knoxville had a college, but it was not a state university. It was just a small college with 150, 200 students or so. And it was rarely even considered part of the city's economy. In fact, it even closed for about 11 years during that period, and nobody paid much attention one way or the other about whether it was going to reopen or not until some people finally got it back going again. But the School for the Deaf was a big deal. It was the only statewide school for the deaf in Tennessee, and it was in Knoxville. And it was also one of the first 8 or 9 schools for the deaf in America. So it was Knoxville was kind of famous suddenly for this School for the Deaf. Which later became known as the Tennessee School for the Deaf, which still exists. But it was established, of course, up in what's now the LMU Law School. But the bigger thing, of course, was when finally in the 1850s, when railroads finally broke through. They built enough bridges, built enough tunnels to finally get all the way through to Knoxville. In 1855, we were connected to Chattanooga and Atlanta and Point South, Mobile, and then in 1857 we were connected to the whole East Coast. So suddenly we had all of this. We had the connections to the whole country practically, and it just changed Knoxville instantly, or started to. And the first things we dwelled on were the extractive industries. The iron, believe it or not, was one of the biggest early industries in Knoxville, and the Knoxville Iron Company, of which the foundry is a remnant, was the biggest concern in that regard. It was a large employer down on Second Creek. The marble industry, or limestone, it was high-grade limestone that was commonly called marble, and still is today. But there was a lot of that around here, and it had a demand all over the country in architecture in New York and Washington. The marble industry, we suddenly, all these quarries started popping up everywhere, and people were calling for Knoxville marble, which was considered more beautiful and more durable than some other kinds of marble. But it was, what else? We had lumber, of course. We had lots and lots of lumber, and that was a big deal. And lumber, the people began clear cutting the mountains nearby and everything, and not at the time thinking very much about it. But lumber led to furniture making. There were furniture factories. What else? Coal, of course. There's coal and nearby, and there were coal companies based here, even though it was not coal right here. It was in the Cumberland Mountains nearby. So Knoxville was really looking up, but then the Civil War hit. It was just like we were just beginning to get this serious start on becoming an industrial city, and the Civil War just knocked the wind out of it for a while. And some people really thought that Knoxville would not even economically survive the Civil War, because the city just seemed damaged and washed up. A lot of the people had left or died during the Civil War. There was not a lot of momentum going on in Knoxville just after the war, but partly thanks to the Iron Company, which was, and some of these entrepreneurs that were, several of them were union officers who'd come down from the industrial cities of the North, who'd been here, visited Knoxville in their role as occupying officers of the Union Army. Came back and said, gosh, there's a lot of natural resources here, we can make a lot of money, and a lot of them came back and stayed here for the rest of their lives and kind of put a city together here. It was a very diverse city. This is, sometimes people kind of, I think, oversimplify things and think, oh, here in the South, you must hate us Yankees or something like that. But Knoxville actually, for the 1850s, I think throughout its entire history, it was full of people from all over the country. So there never was a sense of, at least not until the 20th century, a sense of us versus them in terms of Yankees or Southerners or whatever. People were from all over. Our first newspaper was founded by a guy from Boston. We had people, major leaders from Connecticut. One of the planners of Market Square was from Boston. But it was there were lots and lots of these early these industrial giants of the era just after the Civil War were from other cities. Not all from the North. Some of them were from the South. We began seeing not just extractive industries, but industries that make things, and after the Civil War, and beginning especially in the 1880s, and that's when you have a couple of huge industries. Brookside Mills came in here. That was one of the first great big textile mill, and it was built at this nationally famous weaving mill, they called it, that became a kind of a model for industry. It was a surprisingly progressive place. It was seen as a place that tried to make working seem nice to the people who actually did the work. They had courtyards and gardens and so forth within the Brookside Mill, which was just off of Central. The place we know as Happy Holler now was the community that came up around the people who worked at Brookside Mill. The people who lived up on the hill were people who the executives, and the people who lived down the valleys were mostly the laborers, but they all, for a while at least, got along together. But one of the others I mentioned is the flour business. Mr. J. Allen Smith came in here as if he were a carpetbagger. Came in here with this idea of making a lot of money out of Knoxville, but he was from Georgia, this guy, and he just had this notion of opening a flour mill and began making flour and tried to make the best flour possible and tried to make 30 or 40 different kinds of it in one facility. And his experience, I think, shows you the interconnectivity of a lot of things. You would never guess what flour is such this fluffy white thing, the kind of delicate commodity. But to make it, you need heavy machinery. And J. Allen Smith invited down this guy from England, an Englishman who was known for manufacturing machinery, named William Savage. He'd moved from England. He'd been living in cities up north. J. Allen Smith invited him to Knoxville just to build some rolling mills for his big new factory, which is the White Lily Flour building near the old city today that David Dewhurst is fixing up. And Savage came here, built these giant machines that make this perfectly fluffy, light white flour that the Smith envisioned. But he said, he started getting other jobs in Knoxville, and he said, I can make a living here. And William Savage opened up his own machinery shop and began making machinery, heavy machinery. And his brother from England also, Arthur Savage, moved here and started doing something similar. They were rivals at one time, the Savage brothers. But if you've ever been to Savage Gardens, by the way, in Fountain City area, that really unusual garden off Garden Drive up there, that was, I think it was Arthur Savage's project. But they were an interesting pair that were here just as a result of the White Lily project. But we made, because of Knoxville's position in the Southern Railway, the Coster shops came here, and this was a major train car refurbishing place, and that led to other industries. We had car wheel factories, places that made car wheels for trains. We had places that made furniture for passenger train cars. All these things that were part of the whole Coster shop phenomenon. That was one of the other big industries. By the 1880s and 90s, there were probably 50 or 60 factories in Knoxville, and they were mostly really, I mean, they weren't just like out in an industrial park somewhere. They were all within walking distance of where people worked where people lived, because they were people didn't have cars, obviously, but they needed to live near a workforce, and that's how you got these mill town sort of developments around here. Mechanicsville was named for the mechanics, is what they called the Welsh people, Welsh and blacks who worked mostly at the steel mill, and that was what they were known as, the mechanics. I mentioned Brookside earlier, the whole Happy Holler area that grew up around that was like a mill town of its own. There were other mill towns around the Holston Mill and other things, so places where you would go in there and 90% of the people you met were people associated with this one industry. Out Southern Avenue, it was a lot of people who were from the marble business. They called that Marble City for a while. But it was, all this stuff was going on. One of the guys that came into the fray here was a young guy whose family had been involved in machine shop business before. Got named George Dempster, garbage, and he named his parents all Scottish. I think he had a brother, and it was this is the origin of the word dumpster. It was George Dempster, who was an inventor and a guy that was one of the most prominent figures in Knoxville politics, because he was both city manager back when we had those, and later mayor. Very very interesting and enterprising guy. He was based downtown until the late 1920s, when he built a big factory on the north side. But other people like Weston Fulton, who was a weatherman, he came here actually from Alabama, worked first for the U.S. weather station here, but had started playing with little gauges and things like that, and invented something he called the Sylphon, which was a flexible metal tube that expands and contracts with variations in temperature. And he began building this, and finding out that it had an application in all sorts of things, devices, gauges, thermostats. They say that almost all cars today that have air conditioners have one of these little things that Weston Fulton invented here in Knoxville in 1910, because they don't call them Sylphons anymore. I think they're called flexible metal bellows or something. But he built the Fulton plant in 1915 down that is soon to be a Walmart or something. I'm sorry they tore down the building, because it was a really cool little factory building, very thick walls and these heavy pine floors that they used for almost 100 years, and doing the same thing that Fulton had built the plant to do way back then. But they even invented some things that made possible the first depth charges that were used in the World Wars. They won a good deal of and that's why it became an important war materials place. It employed, at its height, Fulton employed 3,000 or 4,000. It was well into the thousands, may have been more than that, employees, which made it a good deal bigger than the University of Tennessee was at the time. So it was, if you were in that Cumberland Avenue area, you were more likely to be a Fulton employee than a UT student. But there was all this going on, just all these seemingly unconnected, but some slightly connected industries. Meanwhile, there were the other the people like McClung who were getting involved in wholesaling. And C.M. McClung was our Sears Roebuck, more or less. He built the McClung warehouses that you hear about on Jackson Avenue. it was a hardware store, but he also sold lots of the kind of stuff that you would buy at a department store. He sold everything from guns to barbed wire to he had catalogs that people would use in their farms all over the southeast, and would mail off to C.M. McClung and buy stuff. But most of the wholesale industries, and there were lots of, especially you see them on this corresponding block of Gay Street, the 400 block of Gay, are a lot of the big wholesale firms. These were firms that bought often imported stuff or stuff from other parts of the country and sold them in smaller batches to people who owned and ran stores. But this was Knoxville's economy. I mean, again, even into the early 20th century, the university, people call it a college town. In some ways it is, but until the early part of the 20th century, UT was not more than 5% at the most of the city's population. That was in a very small part of the economy and culture of the city. It was all industrial. It was mostly downtown throughout all those years. There were big changes in the 20th century, and it's kind of puzzling looking at some of them, because it would seem as if in the 1920s and 30s and 40s we had several huge boons to the economy. The first thing was opening the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which began as a local initiative effort. It was later heavily funded by the Rockefellers and other people, but also with a great deal of local contribution, both in time and money, to the park project. That was in the 20s. The early 30s, he brought TVA, and TVA was headquartered here mainly just because the TVA's first project was at Norris Dam, and they wanted the headquarters to be close enough that they could drive visitors to Norris Dam and just show what this amazing new dam that they had built. But that was in 1933, and TVA, downtown employed back then 3,000 or 4,000 people. And of course, as a result of TVA, we had the TVA kind of drew interest during the war in places like Alcoa, which already existed, but Alcoa became a major war materials manufacturer. And TVA, being controlled by the government to begin with, was in a position to suddenly be able to supply unlimited amounts of power for the manufacture of aluminum, which is something that demands a great deal of power. And also, TVA is one of the reasons that they put the Oak Ridge National Laboratory beginning as part of the Manhattan Project here during the same period, because it required lots of loads and loads of power that the government wanted to be able to control, have its own power source, and that was TVA again. So you could say that we have all the high tech stuff of Oak Ridge. We have a certain amount of Alcoa and all the other stuff that TVA is connected to, just because of Norris Dam being there to begin with, and the fact that they decided to put the headquarters here instead of in Muscle Shoals, which was the original idea. But the surprising thing about this era, and meanwhile the Vols started winning games too, and you would think that this would be the salad days, the wonderful golden years of Knoxville, from 1920s to the 1950s roughly, but in fact the population stagnated. There was no, in fact, during the 50s, Knoxville actually lost more population than any city in America. We lost 10% of our population. A lot of that had to do with the fact that a lot of these, it was the beginning of the decline of the textile industry in America. A lot of the textile mills went out of business. But my theory, and this is just my theory, and a little bit off the rails from the talk, but is that Knoxville suddenly discovered its outdoors surroundings, the mountains and the lakes, that we started spending all of our time away, sometimes moving away to the lakes and so forth, that the city itself kind of stagnated again, as it had about 100 years ago, 100 years before, when nobody could get here. But anyway, it's you all probably know a good deal of the last 40 or 50 years, as much as I do, about how all these unexpected, unlikely things keep coming in. Whittle Communications, the magazine company that became a TV company, drew hundreds of people from around the country to work here. And about the same time, people started making video projects and so forth, and that kind of, some of these things kind of connected to each other and led to things like Scripps Networks being here. And also the Regal Cinema. Who would have guessed that we would be the headquarters of the biggest cinema company in the world? But it seems to be there's I hate the word synergy, but a certain virtue that comes with complexity in terms of an economy. You have lots of different things going on almost independently that they sometimes connect and spew out something that you would never have expected. But that's my very, very, very quick history of Knoxville's industry and economy. And I'm sure I've left out many things I can think of right now. But if you all have any questions, I'm at your service. It's endlessly fascinating just watching the yeah, Joe.
Jack, I got a question about Market Square. Yeah. Was it always like this?
Of course it was, Joe. Yeah, it was exactly like that. Yeah. No, Market Square has changed a great many times over the years. Sometimes reflecting the city around it. Usually reflecting the city around it. In my book I mentioned in the 1870s it was kind of like the Wild West or something. It was mostly saddleries and gun makers and saloons and stuff. But in the 1880s it was like the east side of New York or something. It was lots of little delis and shops and jewelers and things, and full of immigrants the whole time. And it's just been so fascinating. And this is not the first time it's gone upscale. It tried to go upscale like in 1900 when it became the Great White Way of Knoxville. It was the first brightly lit part of town in the early 20th century. But then it went way downhill after the 1920s. It became kind of just a dump, more or less. And it was after some people, after Arnstein retired and various other things happened. But it's always in flux, it seems like. It's always been, one thing it always has been, or one thing it used to be that it is again, is an almost 24-hour place. And it was, I think 100 years ago, it was a place where people lived, a place where people worked, a place where people drank and danced and everything else, which is what they do now. So in so many ways, I think Knoxville is coming back around to what it was. I think in the what I think is its high point, which was the 1890s, roughly to the World War I era, when people lived and worked and played often in the same buildings and within close walking distance of each other. Yeah.
When I was a child, they said the international airport that actually went to Atlanta was supposed to be in Knoxville. Have you ever heard that?
No, I haven't. But there've been other. There's another story that I've heard that they were supposed to put the UN in Gatlinburg, but so I
got a margarita.
Yeah, but maybe so. I've heard stranger things, I suppose. But Atlanta, Knoxville used to be bigger than Atlanta, but not that recently. I mean, Knoxville was bigger than Atlanta.
That was probably 50 years ago.
Yeah.
50 plus years ago, that was.
Yeah, during the history of aviation, Atlanta's always been bigger than Knoxville. But in the mid 19th century, Knoxville they were at the time of the Civil War, they were about the same size cities. But yeah, but I'd be surprised. But I'm surprised at a lot of things that turn out to be true. So if you ever get any documentation about that, I want to know about it.
What was air quality like back then?
It was terrible. It was. In fact, there were a lot of mentioning Market Square. A lot of the very first complaints about air quality were on Market Square. They didn't use the word air pollution. They just called it smoke. But it was there was a particular professor at the university that came over here, and that was his specialty, to talk about how to mitigate the smoke menace, and which is how they talked about it. But that's something they didn't, until the 20th century, and you can see this in the images of Knoxville, these idealistic bird's eye views of Knoxville that show trains coming in all the time, and steamboats leaving, and so forth, and all the factories that all over the place, and you can tell where they all are because of the belching black smoke, and it was almost like a flower, the black smoke. This is the sign that a city's really working. But I don't think it was really a problem. I don't think people had recognized it as a problem until the 20th century, and people you probably heard people talk about how I've been talked about people living as close as Fountain City who don't like to come to Knoxville because they say after a couple of hours downtown you blow your nose and it's all black, because it was just full of soot everywhere you went. And even James Agee in one of his Fortune magazine articles about TVA talked about how sooty Knoxville was. And when Ernie Powell came here in 1935, he said this may be the dirtiest city in the world, and because everything was covered with soot. So that was a real visual picture of what it looked like. That was a downside, I think. I'm glad we fixed a few of those things. And I think water quality is better than it was when I was a kid. I mean, you just didn't go close to the river when I was a kid because it stank, and it was full of dead things. But now it's an attractive amenity. It's an appealing thing. But yeah, it was not good probably after 1875 or so. You probably would walk out and you would notice a smell of something.
Jack, during the last few years, I've been in a lot of discussions with economic development folks and people that said a center like this may not be a good idea for our community. And I heard some comments that really kind of hurt a little bit, but one of the comments I heard was that we're not a very enterprising community. And it's just not in our DNA to be bubbling up businesses. And I couldn't think of anyone who's probably looked back to the womb in terms of Knoxville more than you have. We want to see your reaction to that.
Yeah, I think that's stupid. I think we don't have a DNA. We're all from other places. How many people were born in Knoxville in this room? Yeah, there's what, about a quarter of us or so, and that's typical. But and their parents were probably born somewhere else too. So we're all just a different mixture of people. There has been cultural and political and certain kinds of power things that have tried to clamp down on one thing or another over the years, and sometimes very effectively. But I think the individuals, someone told me it's not in our DNA to take public transportation, and I think, well, that's crazy, because 100 years ago we had a model electric streetcar system, and literally everybody took public transportation. You couldn't get around in Knoxville without it in the 1890s and later. So it's be skeptical anytime anybody mentions DNA in terms of a city's destiny. Sure.